Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast, number 767. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. In this week's podcast, we continue our summer dive into critical thinking. In this installment, we consider research and evidence. The discussion of research and evidence ties into this week's installment of Reread Saturday. We're talking about credibility in that scenario. Research and evidence provide credibility, and that's not always a good thing. We also have Tony Timbol, who brings his To Tell a Story column to the podcast. In this installment, Mr. Timbol continues to unravel the mystery of agile requirements and user stories. In Reread Saturday News, credibility is the fourth requirement for maximum stickiness. That's, of course, short of Gorilla Glue. Discussed in Made to Stick, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die by Dan and Chip Heath. Credibility is defined as the quality or power of inspiring belief or trust. Without credibility, the attributes of simplicity, unexpectedness, and concreteness crumble. Remember, buy a copy, link in the show notes. Critical Thinking, Evidence and Research, Introduction, Thomas M. Cagley Jr., Megan E. Cagley. In our review of critical thinking, we've adopted a simple definition: thinking, weighing logic, intuition, authority, and research. As noted in an earlier essay, this definition is influenced by Paul Gibbons and Tricia Kennedy's book, Change Myths. Research and/or evidence is an important component of critical thinking. The problem is what passes for research is often just a Google search. Before accepting research presented by someone else, you need to test it. The scientific method is one method of evaluating research. This approach begins with forming a hypothesis, followed by making a prediction, conducting an experiment, and finally analyzing the results to prove or disprove the hypothesis. The scientific method is the gold standard and is often viewed as too heavy for the workaday world. Even if you can't replicate an experiment, you need to review how others tested the idea. Use the structure of the scientific method to make sure that you are on solid ground. Critical thinking based on accurate and trustworthy data is more apt to be right. Why do we care? Valid research aims to provide evidence and support for a particular claim, hypothesis, or theory. Valid research is essential for making informed decisions, shaping policies, and advancing our understanding of various subjects. When evaluating data, there are several characteristics of valid research, including objective design. The research design should be unbiased and objective. The study should be structured to cut out any potential sources of bias or confounding variables. Appropriate sampling. The sample should be representative of the population to ensure that the findings can be generalized. Make sure you understand statistical sampling. Reliable data collection. Data should be collected using reliable and valid measures, and the instruments or methods should be used consistently and accurately. Think automation. Controlled variables. Experiments should control for confounding variables that could affect results. This provides a path to attribute the observed effects to variables you're studying. Peer reviews. Valid research undergoes a peer review process where experts in the field critically evaluate the study's methods, analysis, and conclusions. Anyone can publish anything on the internet. Just saying. In academic literature, these features are generally part of published papers. I picked up a copy of Science, the journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, from May 2005. The first article I looked at, the Great Sumatra Andaman Earthquake of 26 December 2004, ticked all of these boxes. The scientists shared their experimental design, described how the data was collected, which variables were tested, shared the math, and subjected the paper to a peer review. This is the type of research needed for evaluating topics critically. It generates authority. This type of research is rare when evaluating whether to adopt Scrum or any other framework in a corporate environment. While little rigorous research happens during adoption of any framework, the initial decision should search out more than just anecdotal results. The closest common approach to an experiment is a pilot implementation. Success criteria might be evaluated, but rarely is the pilot constructed as a controlled experiment. One of the most common pilot failures occurs when the best or the most interested team is selected. The results will only be extendable to similar teams. As an example, over the past 2 decades, I've observed that more and more corporate training has been delivered virtually. It's less expensive. This approach to training uses any number of combinations of synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid, video, and live interactions. The question that has been on my mind is whether anyone can prove these approaches are effective. At Agile 2023, I spent several hours visiting the training vendors. I was on a bit of a mission. I asked each vendor supplying remote training how they knew remote training was effective and how theirs stacked up. A few took my name and probably blacklisted me with a promise to respond after the conference. I haven't seen anything, by the way. Most provided anecdotal evidence of their effectiveness. I had one honest person say that overall there really had no evidence that remote learning was effective, but it was what organizations would buy. Given the lack of evidence, I decided to ask other consultants and trainers during meals and happy hours. I heard a lot of beliefs, but no one pointed me at solid evidence or research. Corporate training is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Link in the show notes to statistics on corporate training. The data on effective approaches may exist buried deep in HR training journals, but most providers haven't seen it. Organizations aren't making decisions on training approaches based on rigorous data or critical thinking. Next, a little more on levels of research before we wrap up our summer vacation on critical thinking. P.S. One common theme I did hear in all of my conversations on virtual training was that if the attendees weren't mentally present, it was a waste of money. This is an assertion that is credible even without research. Thoughts, comments, all welcome. And by the way, if you have good data on the effectiveness of remote training, I'd be really interested in getting a hold of it. Let me know. Tony Timbol, welcome back to the Software Process and Measurement Cast. Tony, your To Tell a Story column I get a big kick out of. I end up usually with at least half a page of notes when we're recording, and then I get to refine them because I get to edit all this stuff, and which means I get to re-listen to it again, which I recommend to people that they actually listen more than once to your stuff because it is rich with information.
It's great to be here and great to talk about user stories and requirements and getting vision and value out of the minds of content authors and into the minds of developers and testers.
Let's talk about user stories. And, let's face it, if you're building something that is more than just a simple enhancement, and maybe even a simple enhancement, there might be multiple user stories involved. And some of them might be building and developing and showing them to the users and all that. But some of it may be that back end stuff or architecture. Do user stories change, and are they different kinds of user stories, or do you still, or should they all be smushed up into one? how do you deal with the back end of a project with user stories? I guess we do phase user stories, right? That would be the way to do that.
Yeah, that still waterfalls a little bit the idea of incremental development. The way to look at user stories is that regardless of the life cycle of a particular, I don't even want to use the word project, of a product development or a product life cycle, right? So let's say you have a product life cycle from ideation to retirement. Okay. So what do the user stories look like throughout that entire life cycle? Well, at the beginning, you're going to have some stories that are more exploratory. At the end, you're going to have user stories that are about a retirement, about closing the system down. So the nature of the user stories do change as far as their intent. But as far as their actual construction, there's still communication of desire, of aspiration. As a user, I want to do this so that I can achieve that benefit. Now, you can use different syntaxes for user stories to meet different needs. For example, you're familiar with behavior-driven development. The given, when, then format of user stories are very useful for not just writing clear acceptance criteria, but actually writing user stories to meet particular systematic points of view. In other words, you're trying to build in infrastructure type of functionality. Given a server mean time to repair has dropped below SLA levels, when the MTTR has exceeded that threshold, then do this type of stuff. And then how do you build that infrastructure capability into the system? So yes, user stories will change to the life cycle of a product, not necessarily a project, but of a product. And that's okay. It's a good thing.
I agree. And I have absolutely zero qualms. And I'd love to live in a world where everything was product and productized and people thought of it that way. But I have this feeling, this thing going on in the back of my mind that says that people are still doing projects, and that they do some development, and they may have user stories, and it may be almost all of the functionality goes down that path. And then they get to the end and they have to do a big integration test or a all-in pen test or something along those lines. Are those user stories? How would one think about that?
Those should be user stories. In other words, all work can be done in an agile way. That doesn't mean to say that there won't be in an organization some work that's waterfall nature, but I've always said that any waterfall team can simply become a Kanban team and gain the benefits of the agile way of doing things by simply being a Kanban team, and because that's a lightweight way in which to do work, but to have attention on work in process and on WIP limits and on flow, and be able to recognize those metrics simply and easily rather than sticking in a sequential relay race handoff of waterfall where you go requirements, design, build, test, where you can have that cycle compressed within the whatever time box that the Kanban team works on. So yes, all work can be done in agile and all work can be represented by user stories.
So if you didn't want to fall down the iter fall or some sort of a scenario where major system, major implications if it doesn't all fit together well or has a security bug. How would you bake all of the needs into a single functional user story to take care of all that?
Well, you can't because a user story by its very nature is time box limited and constraint limited. In other words, a user story should be something that can get completed in a time box. Now, the length of the time box can be at the choice of the team, right? So let's say you take an infrastructure team that is supporting platforms, and you tell them, and they say, I want to go agile. Okay, great. You don't necessarily have a Scrum cycle. So now you could use a Scrum cycle if you wanted to, but just start out as a Kanban team. So your infrastructure team, they do platform solutioning. They deploy multiple instances of OpenShift or SQL Server, or whatever their platform is, or Kubernetes, whatever it is. but they have work that needs to get done. So the challenge for those types of teams is to represent their work in a way that respects a time box of some limit, of some constraint. And that's going to be the biggest challenge. And so I tell the Kanban teams, look, start with a month time box. Any user story, any piece of scope that you need to get done, regardless of its content, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's writing a script, can you get it done in a month? Once they apply that time box constraint, it forces them to immediately understand that unlimited demand meets limited capacity somewhere. And so that limited capacity conversation has to occur either internally within that team or broadly within the organization. And so that's the beauty of agile, of incremental, right? The whole idea of the increment is to say it's not forever. There is a time box constraint. And so moving infrastructure teams, security teams to that mindset is very, very difficult because they're used to thinking broadly and not having any time constraints other than, arbitrary deadlines, that they have to be given, which is okay. Arbitrary deadlines aren't a problem for Agile. But the biggest problem is the idea of respecting a time box boundary for a piece of scope. That's where Agile wins over waterfall methods. That's where Agile economics gains the fast feedback that you get from the work, not just with customers, but with yourself.
Do you really think that organizations have wrestled with the fact that they do have to deal with unlimited demands and limited supply?
That is the biggest challenge. And so I've been using that phrase in my training for the last 2 months. And it is incredible what reaction it gets. It inspires both hope and creates fear. Inspires hope that finally the business can have reasonable expectations of IT. It also creates fear that IT now will be seen as they can't do everything, which is reality. They can't. So stop lying that you can do everything and you can deliver everything, and begin to give the customer not just what they want, but what they need in the time box that is reasonable. And so that is a challenge, and good coaches will use that idea to foster change. And so just a quick shout out, the whether you're using a SAFe framework or whether you're using an Agile framework or less framework, having them face that quandary, that the existential question. You have unlimited demand, that's okay, but you have limited capacity. That's reality. Where those two meet is in planning. And that's where you have to, whether it's PI planning in the SAFe framework or iteration planning or sprint planning at the team level, that's where unlimited demand meets limited capacity, and you have to be courageous enough to tell the truth.
And what if the answer from the organization is start it all? You don't get that choice.
I have a good friend. That's where courage comes in. You got to push back. You have to say, we can't start it all. I have a good coach friend who has a great phrase I've adopted, I've stolen. It's stop starting and start finishing.
That is that is an Agile bumper sticker, and I don't know where it really ever came from, but it's been around for a long time. Yeah, I love that too. Yep. Except I think we all recognize that people are doing what they have to do to stay employed, and saying yes is far easier. Saying yes and then forgetting about it, and hopefully it'll go away, or people will forget that it's on the backlog and has been there for 22 years and 4 days and 3 months.
Agile best practices and Agile culture are not going to fix toxic organizations.
Okay. I'm glad you finally got there. Yes, absolutely.
Toxic organizations are going to continue to be, and methodology is never going to fix them. That's going to take people with courage to change the system and the culture.
Yeah. It starts by changing the behavior. All culture is a bunch of behaviors that people have learned and have accepted. Tony,
Right.
again, absolutely fantastic. I can't wait to go back, and I can't wait to get these on the air so that I know people that I want to listen to these. So this will be fantastic. Tony, how can people continue the conversation? How can they find out about you and Agile Ready and your wonderful new book?
So you can check on TonyTimbol.com and sign up for my Agile Mastery newsletter. You'll get a free copy of the Incremental Requirements Unleash Business Agility ebook. If you want a print edition, you can link to Amazon and order it there. I'll be glad to sign it if you send it to me, and I'll send it back. Or if you want to just tell me, hey, look, I'll buy the book from you. So I'll order the book, I'll bring it in, I'll sign it, and I'll ship it to you. We can do it that way as well. And so I'll be glad to do that. And of course, you can always visit beagileready.com, which is also linked to TonyTimbol.com to check out the Agile Ready product and platform.
Absolutely super. Thank you again, Tony, for spending time with the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
In the next Software Process and Measurement Cast, number 768, we talked to Phil Alves, CEO of Dev Squad. We discussed how he structures teams to perform in a dynamic environment. Software development of any stripe is a team sport. You either get it right or suffer the consequences.